welcome back to Beyond Motion. Here we are. We've done it. We're having another podcast. Today's topic is one that I think is close to what we have to deal with here and what we work on a regular basis, just because it's a system that requires a lot of resources, a lot of innovation, I would say, but in motion capture. And so learn a little bit more about what it is, what people are using it for, what your experiences have been, where we think it can head. So, I mean, just to kick us off, like, in your words, what is motion capture?
In my words, what is motion capture?
Yeah.
I mean,
you're writing the textbook.
I'm writing the textbook. I mean, there's so many different modalities you can use for motion capture. So I feel like you can't describe it as like motion capture is using yada, yada, yada to collect.
Sure.
Data.
Motion capture is capturing motion.
Yeah. I mean, basically, right? It's like capturing motion, not even just of humans. Like it could be an animal. It could be anything, right? So motion capture is capturing motion with technology in some way. But I mean, I guess on the list of things to talk to for today, we are talking about the different types of technology used for that. Obviously, we're most familiar with inertial motion capture, and even within that category, human movement.
Right. Yeah. You keep just going deeper and deeper into those layers.
Yeah.
When does something turn from just like taking a video of something to performing motion capture on it? What would you say is the distinction between those two things?
There has to be some kind of analysis done to recognize a position and an angle.
Sure.
Right? That's what I would think.
I would agree. It's like the measurement is what motion capture is.
Sure.
You can think of the two words, right? Motion obviously is an easy one. It's moving, whether that be of an object or a system like a person or an animal. And then capture being like making a measurement of it.
Yeah.
So, and doing so in these iterations, right? Or samples. And then putting that all together and seeing what you can find out.
Yeah, exactly.
Are you familiar with like the history of motion capture at all?
I wouldn't say like from the very beginning. Do you have any history to throw out here?
Have you seen that the horse, I think it's pronounced Muybridge, but it's like a series of pictures of a horse running.
Oh, yes.
Have you seen that before?
Yeah, like the little flip books.
Yeah. Like that's like the kind of the basis of motion capture as we know it.
Okay.
And so it was this guy, Muybridge. I don't actually have any clue why he was doing it. I'm sure that would be a really interesting point to potentially look up. But that's like a famous series of photos that demonstrated a horse running.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as I know, that's like when you're looking at like the history of motion capture as we know it from like a technology standpoint, it always like goes back to that.
Yeah.
And then from there, you're taking a series of images. Curious to know, I guess, what his purpose of that was. It scientific or was it just like out of curiosity? I have no clue.
I don't know, because I mean, we're talking about motion capture can be used for scientific and non-scientific purposes. Like we see it all the time in animation and movies, and I mean that has a scientific edge to it somehow, but you're not collecting that measurement with the purpose of finding out what's the joint angle at this point in time. It's for the purpose of animating something on top of whoever's performing that movement.
You're not like testing a hypothesis while you're making a video game, right?
And it also the only requirement is it has to look good, right? It doesn't have to be like
accurate.
It doesn't have to be necessarily calibrated perfectly, as long as it looks right.
Right. Yeah. So I and then I'm guessing that's where it went from there. I don't know when it started converting into more of a scientific analysis, because let's just say that Muybridge was collecting these images for some sort of qualitative purpose, right? Like just wanting to understand something about the horse. I don't know. And then from there, I wonder what the immediate next application was. Was it in animation or was it in science?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I almost want to like pause here and
Just
look it up.
Look it up. Do it in real time.
Let's do it.
See what's going on. It's spelled Muybridge.
Okay, so he's a photographer.
It looks, so what I'm picking up is that it was actually for technology, like it was to answer a question, is there a flight phase in the horse?
Okay.
And then 2, can the photography technology be improved, I think was like what they were sort of after. Like,
so it was to answer a scientific question.
To an extent,
yeah.
Not necessarily about the motion itself, but how do we set ourselves up to be able to capture these things?
Sure.
So then from there, I mean, that gives way to that next wave of film and like all these things. So it seems like the answering that technological question, maybe from a science, actually influenced the culture from that point forward.
Yeah.
Because then you look at like the next stages are, I don't know, I think of like Disney and them, you would see like the combination of animation and real footage.
Yeah.
And so they would like be either like sketching on top of a image to make this person look like they were a cartoon kind of a thing. Or adding cartoons to images as well. And then from there, I don't know, maybe that's when like the next stage is really true science investigation as we know it, where it's like multiple cameras, you've got reflective markers, you're applying new modeling techniques, things like that.
Well, it used to be, and your comment reminded me of, like, I remember hearing about when they made Bambi, all of their artists went out and just like watched deer.
Wow.
Like, and drew pictures, took videos of them, like, and that was how they animated deer. It's like, you're not using anything but your eyes to capture it in that case, and then you're translating it. So I mean, is that still motion capture somehow?
I think so. I would think it is. And I guess then maybe the next evolution is not drawing, but then like the computerization of it, right? So digitizing it, which I know if you look at some of the history of, you know, before the sort of optical motion capture systems that we know today, where a lot of that targeting and everything is done almost automatically in the software. Before, people would have to sit there on a projection screen, right? Have this thing projected on the wall and then like digitize individual points frame by frame by frame by frame.
Yeah, it was all super manual.
I can't even imagine. That was probably the most mundane job that ever existed, was just going through those every single time.
And you had to know what you were doing too.
Definitely.
So it's not just like a turn your brain off process.
Yeah, it's amazing. I think at this point, especially with, you know, where Markerless is heading, well, you know, we've essentially programmed that job entirely. And you kind of still get back some of the flexibility that you may have had in the early days, because you could just capture somebody on video. And then if somebody was going to sit there and tell you, okay, here's the knee, here's the ankle, here's the hip at each frame, you were there's a little bit more leniency, I would say, to like what the requirements are for the actual capture.
Totally.
Whereas then when you got into like ultra detailed motion capture, whether it be sensor based or with the markers, now you have all these constraints that have to be met because you have to get the best data possible. And now it's like Markerless is kind of adding back like a little bit of that flexibility, because now you don't have to, you just capture the person and then the computer can kind of figure out where those points are from time to time.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to think of it. You have to make it more complicated before you can go back to basics, right?
Sometimes.
You have to really dive into like, okay, how do we do this? And then you can kind of reverse engineer it back. So like, all right, let's make it simple again.
Right. So yeah, I mean, pretty interesting history overall. And I like how it was sort of like a combination between a science and entertainment, even from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And then you see that so widely used, you know, with today's technology. You know, of course, our main involvement is on the biomechanics side of things. But when you explain motion capture, oftentimes when I talk to people who are not in our industry and tell them about like some of our systems, and let's say we're talking about the inertial motion capture system, I immediately go to like video game development or like Avatar or one of these
I do the same thing.
Lord of the Rings, one of these movies that was created using those things.
Yeah, it's like, have you ever seen the behind the scenes on like any of these action movies where people are wearing these white ping pong balls all over them? Like, that's what we do, but not that modality.
We make sensors that do that.
We make sensors that do that part. But that's what I go to as well, because that's really the main thing that most people are going to think of and associate with motion capture.
Yeah. So it sort of comes back to, what is motion capture? And again, it's capturing motion, but with the purpose of taking measurement. I think is probably the important distinction there versus
I agree.
just filming and, appreciating what's happening, but not necessarily doing it with any sort of analysis.
Right. Otherwise, you're just taking a video
of your dog or something.
Yeah, it's like, oh, cool. You move from there to there.
Yeah. So animation, entertainment, obviously big areas, big application areas that we see motion capture used in broadly. Maybe we can dive in a little bit to the biomechanics side of it.
Sure.
And I mean, I think that's another arena there's a lot going on because, you can either look at motion from the standpoint of like, what's the result of the motion or like what's actually happening within the motion. So for instance, you have a certain step length. And then so the result might be what's your step time, like a parameter that can be derived from the motion, which obviously is one element to the motion capture, the analysis piece of it.
Right.
While simultaneously also looking at like the curve, the signal of knee flexion or something like that, which is again produced from the motion capture, but sort of fundamentally different ways of even looking at like movement in general. One you can call like space and time, and then this one just being like angulation. So you were recently at a fun biomechanics conference. Did you see anything that came out about motion capture in particular and like some of the things that people were doing?
There at this conference, there was actually a lot about like modeling motion capture. Yeah. They went into detail on some of the lectures that they had on some of the, like attempting to model some of this randomness and figure out exactly what different correlations between, certain movement patterns are. Maybe that's gait, maybe that's something else. But unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to attend those lectures. Sure, I heard it secondhand from some of the attendees that I was speaking with, but it all sounded really interesting. And it was really cool that there was a big motion capture emphasis at the conference this year. Where, I mean, motion capture is a very big part of biomechanics in general because you're analyzing human movement, whether that's the actual kinematics part, which is often the part of motion capture that you're looking at for your research and trying to answer questions of, but also like force production, muscle activation, things like that. That's all biomechanics, but not motion capture.
Right. Yeah, it's just one component of it, right? Yeah, and I mean, I think that what it brings to the table is, I think that it really tells the kind of main parts of the story of what's happening when somebody is moving.
Yeah.
You get access to that through the visualizations that get created, whether they be these stick figures on video or these, high resolution 3D avatars that are recreating the movement.
Yeah. Or just a time series signal that you get to watch cycle on and off.
Right. Yeah. And I think both of those, like, it really just, it goes so deep into the details of actually what's happening, which it sort of lays the context for everything else to be able to be looked at within that sort of biomechanics lens. Oftentimes you may look at just muscle activation just as its own, right? And say, okay, well, the mean activation during the task was this, right? Whatever microvolts. But it becomes so much more impactful and useful when you can then contextualize that activation pattern based off of, this was this close to peak knee flexion, or it was, as the knee was flexing, you were seeing the quad fire. So you get to understand a little bit more about the body's pathways. And, without that anchor of the motion capture, I think it can be really hard to describe some of the other biomechanical, let's say, methods.
Definitely.
You kind of need the framework of the motion capture to really tell the full story about those things. So I know we talk to our customers a lot about even just incorporating like a video camera. So now we're getting back to like, okay, is it?
Yeah, let's take a video.
Is it motion capture?
Is it motion capture?
But in any case, like we intuitively can pick up on motion capture just by watching somebody. Now we're not necessarily assigning values to it, like however many degrees are being experienced or rotational velocity or something like that. But in your brain, you can look at something and you can see like when those certain events might be happening, and then look back and relate that to, the EMG or the force or what have you. So it's kind of like base level, like get a video in there so that you understand what's happening in the real world.
Exactly. Because with our system, we build this biomechanical model that's essentially just this avatar in space. We don't know what the person is interacting with. We don't know if we're doing something simple like running analysis and like something weird happened. Did they trip over something? Like what happened at that point in time? So, adding that context without intending to use it for motion capture is super important, even in that of itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there's, that's what makes it such a powerful tool, and probably why there's so many different types of motion capture, because people just continually think that there's going to be a better way that they can figure out how to do this. And that's been cool to see, because we're a part of one of those stories with the inertial motion capture side of things. Then you get exposure to all these other types, and you see kind of the journeys that they're going down.
Yeah, now we're a part of the Markerless motion capture side too. So it's been cool to see and just learn more about the advantages and limitations of that technology. And obviously we're pretty well versed in the technology that we manufacture.
Yeah.
And have to stay up to date with our competitors and what that technology looks like. And even not even competitors, but just our colleagues in the motion capture business, right? But it is interesting to see. I think all of these different technologies were developed because each one has distinct disadvantages.
Yeah.
And so someone built another system to try to fill that gap, and that other system also has disadvantages, right? So it's just kind of interesting to see all of that together. Ideal world would be like combine everything. You don't miss a single thing, right?
Yeah. But these hybrid systems.
Yeah, exactly.
Got to figure those ones out, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So within motion capture, then we have all these different kinds, and we've alluded to two of them. Well, I guess three of them through our discussion so far.
Yeah.
With the markerless motion capture being the sort of newest innovation, inertial motion capture, which is most of what we do here at Neuraxon, and then optical motion capture, which is more of the traditional approach. I guess, in your opinion, what solutions are each one of those providing to like our, let's say, general users that we have, our biomechanists, people that perform motion capture with the intent of doing analysis?
Oh, it's an interesting question. So by what is that providing to them? Do you mean like what
value
outputs are you looking for, or
for each of those modalities? Because as you mentioned, one was created to help solve the problems of another, but then maybe has its own issues. But if you were to look at those individually, what are they bringing to the table in particular?
Yeah, sure. Well, so optical motion capture, which is the most traditional motion capture system that everyone's familiar with, it's the put white ping pong balls all over someone's body and then throw it into a software. That has the obvious advantage of like you have cameras seeing exactly what that person was doing. So there is little room for mistakes when it comes to, this wasn't modeled correctly. It's like, no, I saw the marker, it was right there.
Right.
And also being able to capture positional data as well, not even just angular data in this capture volume that you have. You know exactly how far someone walked, exactly what their step length, stride length was because you saw it. Right. And that's why I think that technology has become the gold standard and has continued to be the gold standard. But the obvious disadvantages of that are, marker occlusion. So markers are the points on the body that you have those ping pong balls attached to. If you're trying to capture someone moving, like in a car, for example, how do you do that without like something being in front of that person?
Right.
That is where a lot of those challenges come into play. And then obviously you have to have this dedicated space with however many cameras you're using to create this volume. And if you leave, cameras don't see you anymore. Right. So I think those are really the main limitations that the inertial motion capture system aimed to solve. Right. So with the inertial motion capture, you have, there's no cameras at all. It's a completely different principle.
Right.
And I like to use our colleague John Cockcroft's, explanation of what an IMU is compared to an optical based motion capture system a lot. When I explain it, he's like, well, the optical motion capture system is your eyes, and the inertial motion capture system is more like your ears.
Interesting. Okay.
So if you close your eyes and you move your head to the side, you know exactly what your head position is, even though you didn't see it, because you have little inertial measurement units inside of your ears deciding what orientation your head is in, unless it's messed up for some other reason, right? But, that's how it all works. But then you have to assign it to a model, and you have to make sure that model works correctly. And there's no cameras involved. We're just looking at the angular position of these sensors, right? So that has obvious challenges as well. But even still, it's come to be very comparable to these optical motion capture systems.
Yeah.
I mean, just reading about it in research and seeing our users use that equipment for not even just research, for in the applied world, clinical, sports science, etc.
Yeah, so like the optical motion capture maybe a little bit more restrictive in some ways, but typically going to enhance your accuracy to to an extent, because of, like you said, you're able to see those points that you've decided make up your model. Like you can physically construct your model more or less in reality to then be picked up by the cameras in a lot of ways.
And then if it's wrong, a lot of it's user error, right? Did you place the marker in the correct spot?
Right.
So
maybe more control too, even over some of the cleaning that might be necessary in some ways. But then the inertial motion capture, it sort of loosens those restrictions and eliminates some of the requirements that you might have in terms of, all the, like you said, no cameras required.
No setup in terms of the environment whatsoever.
Exactly. You just instrument the person and go about your business. And, feasibly that could even be done over extended distances, right? Like, if you're able to log data. So you've kind of broken the person out of the lab, eliminated the need for these cameras. So then how do we make our way back to markerless motion capture? What is that solving?
I think it's solving the problem that people just don't like putting anything on their subjects at all, right?
So a convenience factor.
I think so. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that makes the most sense for sure. It's, time will tell if it is the sort of answer to even like inter-rater issues, because essentially you're relying on the computer to do the modeling. versus, even if like we were to, whether it be inertial sensors, maybe not so much, but there's definitely a requirement to kind of keep sensors in the same places.
Exactly.
But definitely with optical motion capture, you and I might put the markers on in different places, and that can skew then, the measurements, right?
Yeah. Same with IMUs, right?
Yeah.
I mean, constraints are less, but you still need symmetry between sides.
So now Markerless kind of just puts that responsibility onto the computer side. And as long as you get your good image from your video cameras, or camera even in some cases, then, maybe that enhances the repeatability of some of that stuff.
Yeah.
But of course, not without its own challenges even too, right? And sort of some of your complete reliance on now the computer and what's happening sort of in this black box type of a situation, right? Like you don't really get to decide within the processing portion that you want it to do one thing in particular for this one frame, right? It's just kind of all lumped in there, shot into this black box, and then out are the results. And maybe you can make some adjustments on the back end, but
yeah, I mean, I think the technology is out there and will continue to improve to be able to make those modifications for sure.
Yeah.
But it's almost it makes you wonder if it's gonna go back in the opposite direction, where we tried so hard to uncomplicate it. And we're like, oh wait, no, we really like the flexibility that the complexity offered us in terms of processing.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. You gotta totally figure out the entire landscape to then just realize that, oh yeah, this is actually the best option. So we've been talking about the types of motion capture. We've touched on optical, inertial, markerless. I think one that we've seen from time to time too, I don't necessarily know how prevalent it is, but it's magnetic motion capture.
Mm-hmm.
So presumably that would be like, it seems like that's going into that complex direction. Like you need, typically there's, much higher accuracy in terms of the ability to detect the, positional data of the stylus and, what you're essentially digitizing. Or if you're actually having maybe these like active markers even that are passing through this magnetic field. So you can get like ultra high resolution data from that, but you're in this sort of restricted environment because of the sort of requirements that are needed to have this magnetic system operate cleanly.
And if you have to question the accuracy of it as well, if your environment doesn't meet those very strict requirements of having this like distortion-free, homogeneous magnetic field to work within.
So it kind of goes back into that restrictive area, but maybe for the purpose of then providing like more accurate data.
Right.
In certain contexts, of course. I know one area that I've seen those systems be used is like looking at the motion of like tools, like surgical tools.
Oh, yeah.
And even like motion capture of things going through, probably not real humans, I don't think, but like modeled situations where they're looking at a catheter and they want to be able to track the motion of it.
Yeah.
In these sense. Like really, really fine point movements. And so they need something that can sort of centralize, where is this volume that we're looking at? We can't use cameras because there's no way.
Yeah.
But we can track this magnetic signal through this, electromagnetic environment. So that's one area that I think that I've seen those be used very broadly in kind of probably the modality of choice.
Yeah.
Something like that. Not really what we handle, but.
Yeah, less prevalent with capturing human movement for sure. Although I have seen it used to capture human movement, just not quite as often. And I think it's because there are these vast environmental challenges that just aren't the same as with other types of measurement modalities.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess with those being the types of motion capture that are available, do you think that there's a way to sort of create like a list of basic principles of motion capture? So like you can't have, each one of these is providing some way of measuring something, right? Each one of them kind of measures something different in a sense, right? You've got optical motion captures looking at this landmark traveling through a known volume, right? And then it's taking that, converting it to whatever you want it to, angles or velocities or what have you, position. Inertial motion capture is looking at the gyroscope and the acceleration data, so understanding orientation in 3D space and then turning that into some sort of information. Magnetic motion capture, kind of the same idea as optical. You're measuring something translating through a volume. Markerless is like image processing. So I don't know, that one's a little different. It's not like you have something that you're following necessarily, but like the computer is looking at the images and making sense of those images with reference to whatever it was trained on.
Yeah.
And then creating a model of that. So as I go through that list, each one of those has its own sort of measurement that it provides, like its raw measurement that it provides. But then none of that is really meaningful in a lot of ways.
No, none of it's the output that you're looking for.
Slap a model on that.
Sure.
So in some ways, that really is the motion capture, is like how you decide to model
the modeling,
the movement.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah.
And like, what's your thoughts on like the effects of modeling and how that influences then even maybe the type of system that you want to use?
Oh man, I don't feel super well versed in different modeling techniques.
Sure.
I do know the importance of it, but I mean, even if you apply a similar model to this position-based data capture you're getting with cameras versus this angular-based data capture you're getting with IMUs, you can still end up with different results based on the placement of everything. So you're still kind of boiling it down to how did you capture it? What was your setup like? And you're dealing with those challenges. But the modeling too, take the shoulder, for example. Shoulder goes through an extremely large range of motion in multiple planes. We model the shoulder as projection angles in various planes because it's too hard to model without running into this problem called gimbal lock. Whereas other companies out there that make these motion capture systems will model the shoulder differently. And so when researchers, or not even just researchers, anyone is trying to analyze that data, you can't compare apples to apples because they're completely different models.
Right.
So, that's my understanding of the importance of modeling, but I don't model it myself.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Neither do I.
Yeah.
But I would agree. Of the slight level of knowledge that I have on modeling, it's really just on understanding the value of it and how essentially, right, it's an estimation that you're applying to this data set to say that, I think that this is the construction of the body. Here's where these landmarks exist. Here's the interactions that these landmarks have with each other that create the joint centers. And then what inputs am I getting from these systems to be able to then do that math?
Yeah.
But it really is kind of like the underlying principle of motion capture is like you have to be able to apply a model to it. You have to be able to estimate the motion through these inputs using this framework that you've decided upon.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting about that is like how you can go from like super simple full body model that just has like, I don't know, whatever, 16, landmark positions or segments even, right? And just look at those as like this one system of just those small components to then zooming into like the foot and having, 2 or 3 times more components that you're tracking just on the single foot.
Right.
And, that creates such a difference between the type of data that you're getting.
Sure.
And also then in some ways would sort of decide for you like what system is necessary for you to use too.
Absolutely. Yeah, like how much specificity do you need?
Right.
Like, people ask all the time about finger tracking.
Yeah.
It's not something that we can do at this moment.
Right.
But I mean, that kind of eliminates our system as, something that's in the running for what they need to be able to accomplish what they're trying to do.
Yeah. So that level of detail influences then like what you're actually using to capture that.
For sure.
Probably a very important question for people to answer for themselves if they're trying to decide what motion capture system they should get.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, what am I trying to measure?
Yeah.
Because even like the camera systems, right? Those aren't necessarily scalable up and down.
No, they're not.
Or not conveniently, at least, right?
Yeah.
You might have a volume of a full room with all 8 cameras positioned around those, and you've got the room calibrated and to do these kind of general motion capture type studies. But you can't just rip those off the wall and then put them in
somewhere else,
3x3 box and start capturing the hand, right?
Exactly.
So those are interesting questions for people to that are in the process of trying to decide like what system they should use that they need to address for sure.
Yeah, it puts a lot of the responsibility on the shoulders of these manufacturers as well to not necessarily fully educate all of the people out there who want to buy a motion capture system about the advantages and limitations of each product. I mean, all of these manufacturers have a product to sell, obviously, but it does make it. I mean, it's complicated technology.
Totally.
Right. It's not like you're buying a flower pot. Not something very simple anyway. So
no offense to all you flower pots out there.
No. But it is really interesting. Like we might understand those limitations much better than Joe, who's just learned about motion capture yesterday and thinks he wants a motion capture system.
Yeah.
So it does make that emphasis on education a little bit more prevalent in our hands. But it's really, we still have to emphasize during that conversation with our prospects, like, what are you looking for?
Right.
What is the question you're trying to answer? Tell me more about what this desired setup looks like. And, we want to lead them in the right direction. Right. So.
Yeah. Cause you touched on this in the very beginning about, for animation purposes, like, you don't need to have the correct joint angle. It just needs to look good.
Right.
Right. And so oftentimes those are actually separate things, right? Animating motion and or accurately detecting motion are kind of 2 different stories.
Yeah, I would say so.
And even in the sense that there's, the manufacturers that exist as well are totally different in what they provide. For somebody like us, like we provide biomechanics measurement equipment, right? So like our entire mission is to deliver technology that allows for biomechanical measurement.
Yeah.
So that's like the forefront of what we do. Like obviously we want it to look good and create these, nice looking visualizations. But at the end of the day, it's like what we really are after is to provide accurate data.
Yeah, exactly.
And then, there's even systems that, an inertial motion capture, particularly that are maybe used for like personal VR systems, like, video games. And it's like, you just generally need to, at least at this stage in that technology, like it just needs to be able to know that you're moving, right? And it can kind of clean some things up in real time, smooth it out a little bit, let's say.
But it doesn't need to know like the exact position of your elbow. Or
it's not calculating joint torques,
right.
For instance, in that case.
Yeah. So there are levels of like, okay, how accurate does this system need to be based on like, what do you need it to do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's, that's a fundamental question of, like you were saying, like it's something that has to be addressed when we talk to people is like, well, what's the point? What are you trying to accomplish here?
Mm-hmm.
And then I think even within that, that's another challenge in general is, getting back to our sort of modeling discussion is like some models may produce more accurate results under certain conditions.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So you kind of got these layers that you have to build upon, and without understanding, the really intricate interactions between those things, you could easily assume that just like this is a motion capture system, so it's going to deliver me, exactly what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
When the reality of it
That's
is
not
like,
always the case.
no, there's so many assumptions that have to go into place,
Mm-hmm.
not only just to like create this visual representation of the movement, but then that next layer deeper of here's like what joint angles are being experienced and, throughout that entire thing. And I, that need for accuracy sometimes doesn't line up with the stronger need of practicality, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's what we battle all the time, right? Is like, okay, it's great that this system is accurate, but it's taking me 10 minutes to set it up.
Yeah.
I don't have that 10 minutes. It's like, okay, well, this system maybe now we have the 2D markerless system, right? All you need is the camera. It takes hardly any time to set up at all, but you're not getting nearly as much out of it.
Right.
There are complete planes of movement that you're missing in addition to just the accuracy portion not being there.
Right. Yeah, or the restricted modeling options, right? Like in the case of Markerless, where it's like, yeah, you get what you get. Like there's really not much else that you can play around with.
Exactly. Like you can't really model how this object is interacting with the motion, or you can't try to like create a custom angle somewhere else or place markers in the case of optical motion capture on some object this person is interacting with. It's kind of like this models the hip, knee, and ankle. And that's what it does. Right?
Yeah. Take a video of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, those same things, I think, play into some of the other challenges that we see too in terms of cost. We've kind of gone through some of the environmental limitations. But I mean, there's a whole host of different challenges that sort of exist with motion capture that are also important to take into consideration.
Yeah, right. I mean, we've hit on some of them, right? So like cost, practicality of the environment, of the setup, how long does it take, right? Is something we just discussed. It's like these optical motion capture systems take upwards of 30 minutes just to set up for one participant for one movement.
Right.
Whereas we've taken that, setup time down a little bit. I mean, you can get sensors on someone. We timed it once, right? I did like a lower body motion setup and EMG in 5 minutes or something.
Under 5 minutes, yeah.
But I mean, still practicality is a really big one, especially for the folks in the applied settings who work with patients or clients, and they need to be in and out the door in a certain amount of time. But cost is another big one, right? These camera-based systems are obviously the most expensive.
Yeah, it can be for sure with construction and things like that. There, no doubt. Yeah, and I think that, but it's funny because they all sort of like play into each other, right? It's like, typically a higher cost may come with, higher accuracy and precision, but it also might come with a more complex setup. And so it's,
it's like a Venn diagram.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, pick your favorite.
Yeah.
There's also room for improvement, I think. And so, as all technology, we're constantly like just putting resources into making it better and better and better and better. Come out with a new iPhone every single year somehow that has a new set of features or whatever.
Yeah, another camera.
Yeah, exactly. And everything's got AI in it. And so it's like, where does this take us as we keep going forward? What are some of those things that are potential applications or technology advancements that are going to maybe help close the gap between some of those areas in that Venn diagram. Maybe you can have all three in the future.
Maybe you can. I mean, AI is a really big one. I feel like we've been ending all of our conversations for this podcast with like, where is AI? But no, it's a really big question nowadays, especially like that we're going to see a lot of advancements, and I mean, I hope they're good ones. But I mean, we're talking about the Markerless, right? This machine learning model, might be able to calculate this quickly and without much setup. But what if you want to have more control? What if you want a different model? What if you need to adjust one frame?
Right.
It's not perfect 100% of the time, most of the time. Mm-hmm. So I think what we will see is adding in more flexibility, but in what way, right? What does that interface look like?
Yeah, can you do like rapid retraining?
Yeah.
Like go capture 10 videos of this thing and dump it into this system, and then that'll create your training data set for then you to now have this model of the foot, or whatever it is, high resolution model.
Yeah.
So that'll be interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see how machine learning improves machine learning.
Yeah, right.
I think. And, we touched on this one a little bit, but like hybrid technologies, maybe it's that you don't have to necessarily pick one. You can pick two because they can work seamlessly together. Get the benefits of, the not having occlusions with the inertial motion capture system when needed. And then when not needed, you can get the accuracy of the, distance measurements from the optical system or something like that.
Yeah, sure.
Or, probably more likely markerless and inertial capture than markered and inertial capture. But in any case.
Man, that'd be a fun setup day, that's for sure.
You just have sensors, landmarks all over. You're totally fitted out for that.
Yeah.
I think, improved accessibility is another area which you're already seeing, especially with the markerless technologies that are just available through what seems like a new application every single day. I mean, take like the sort of this end of the spectrum, which is like just pure entertainment. You've got Snapchat filters where you can like become a dog.
Yeah, exactly.
Or on this other side where it's, maybe more scientific, but it's still app driven. And you're able to capture one video of somebody throwing a baseball and it can skew together like a 3D model of that and give you all these parameters of them as they're going through that.
Yeah.
And so, that obviously is going to come with some cost, but it's putting like this immense amount of technology and analysis power into somebody's hand and making that far more accessible than it ever really has been.
Yeah, totally.
From that technology use. So
that's
kind of cool.
I do think what we'll find with the accessibility, and I mean, maybe the AI will solve all of these problems, right? But with the accessibility, I mean, you have fewer people that are biomechanists using motion capture and more people that are just, a lay person. And so when it doesn't work, there's going to be less of an understanding of, okay, maybe this failed because this camera was not in the right position. It's just like, didn't work, So, I mean, that educational standpoint, I do think there will be a gap to bridge in the meantime before hopefully AI catches up and can just figure it out no matter what your setup was, right? Yeah. But I think that I can't imagine that not being somewhat important.
Yeah.
Even as we go into the future.
Right. So like being able to almost like troubleshoot for you.
Yeah.
To an extent. Maybe provide correction too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that definitely helps with improving the accessibility, right? Because it's just like lowering the barrier to entry. Not only because the technology is available more or less to anybody, but then like education is also available to a lot of people, without having to go through years and years and years of, reading and practice and, doing these things on your own. We'll have to see. I think there's a lot of good prospects for, how these systems can be combined and sort of the advancements of technology that we're seeing. I mean, even just being here and seeing like what can be done from the modeling techniques for the inertial motion capture stuff, and like where it is today versus where it was 10 years ago.
Oh yeah.
Is wild. Like there's just so much more out there to that we're constantly improving upon and learning about. And yeah, it's going to be fun to see where this next level actually is, and what can be achieved with when you start to combine these technologies, whether it be the different systems or combining it with machine learning and artificial intelligence.
Right. And as always, we're learning a lot from the users of our technology, and all the applications they're using it in, and how they are combining it with like this virtual reality stuff.
Yeah.
And, robotics and like, anything under the sun, right?
Yeah.
Any way you want to be able to analyze how a person is interacting with some other environment or technology. So we'll continue to keep a close ear on that, and close eye on it to continue learning from those researchers that are actually out there in the trenches, like using the technology.
That's right. We want to solve problems. So if you got problems, come find us.
Come find us. Tell us all your problems. I won't promise that we'll solve 100% of them, but we'll listen.
Yes, we'll listen. Well, that's perfect. I think that's a good ender for us for today. And so thank you for joining me in this wonderful discussion. And thank you all listeners for checking in.
Yeah.
Be sure to follow us on our social media accounts at Neraxon USA. And we will see you next time.